Shana Tova. Our subject is the Avodah service. What is the Avodah service? Our Avodah service is found on pages 443 to 511 of Mishkan HaNefesh for Yom Kippur. However, you need not open your books. We are not going to spend 20 minutes trying to perform a 68-page service. My intent is rather first to give us some background on the Avodah service, so as to allow us profitably to read it on our own. Second, to give us some of the feeling of the original Yom Kippur ceremonies. And finally, to perform a small part of the traditional Avodah service. Traditionally, the Avodah service is part of the Musaf service on Yom Kippur afternoon. Musaf and Avodah are remembrances of the sacrificial cult last performed almost 2,000 years ago at the temple in Jerusalem. Ordinarily, sacrifices were offered 3 times a day, usually by slaughtering animals and burning them on an altar. But on Shabbat and holidays, an additional sacrifice was offered. After the temple was destroyed, the rabbis continued the practice of prayer services 3 times a day, with the additional Musaf service on Shabbat and holidays. The Avodah service is a prayer service, a verbal description, step by detailed step, of the performance of the Yom Kippur ritual, including the ritual sacrifice of animals in the temple by the priests, led by the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. Reform Judaism was born rejecting the Avodah service. The 1885 Pittsburgh platform of the tenets of Reform Judaism held, we recognize in the modern age of universal culture of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. The platform was revised in 1937, 1976, 1997, 1999, and 2004. There was no repudiation of the paragraph 5 rejection of sacrificial worship. In Gates of Repentance, the 1996 predecessor to the 2015 Mishkan HaNefesh, there is no Avodah service. The Amidah prayer, the central prayer of Judaism, said 3 times a day, traditionally contains a prayer requesting the return of the sacrificial cult, the Ritzei prayer. Be favorable, Adonai our God, towards your people Israel and their prayer, and restore the service to the Holy of Holies of your temple, the fire offerings of Israel and their prayer accept with love and favor, and may the service of your people Israel always be favorable to you. The Holy of Holies in the temple was the innermost part of the temple, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and where only the high priest was allowed to enter, and then only once a year on Yom Kippur. The fire offerings of Israel refers to sacrifices, offering by burning them on the altar in the temple. There is a Ritzei prayer in the current Reform Siddur, Mishkan Tefillah, but it is a different prayer. There is no mention of the temple, no mention of the fire offerings of Israel, no mention of a restoration of that sacrificial service. It reads, find favor, Adonai, our people, with your people Israel, and accept their prayer in love. May the worship of your people Israel always be acceptable. God, who is near to all who call, turn lovingly to your servants, pour out your spirit upon us. The abandonment of the sacrificial rites themselves goes back to the destruction of the Second Temple. As Mishkan HaNefesh teaches us, when the temple fell, the sages ruled that atonement would no longer require sacrificial offerings. Instead, God would respond to sincere confession and prayers for forgiveness, accompanied by good deeds. And even before the destruction of the temple, prophets had taught the Jewish people that sacrifice was not necessary for teshuvah, for repentance. As the prophet Hosea said, bring words with you and come back to the eternal. Say to God, forgive all guilt and accept the good. Our bulls will be the offering of our lips. However, as the traditional Ritzei prayer and the traditional Avodah service demonstrate, we did not abandon the memory of the sacrificial cult. Since the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, traditionally, Jews have in fact been offering sincere confession, prayers for forgiveness, and good deeds, but including the recitation of the Avodah prayer service, which recapitulates in words the temple sacrificial rite. Why then did the Reform movement abandon the Avodah service for over 120 years? For several reasons, I think. First, because it seems so primitive, especially when compared with the religion of the nations in which Reform Judaism appeared, where Christianity had done away with the sacrifices of the Hebrew Bible and symbolically substituted the sacrificial blood and body of Christ in the sacramental wine and wafer. And the Reform movement sought, among other things, to make their members comfortable in the century of the European Enlightenment. Second, there were parts of the Avodah service that no one now understands and to some might seem frankly ridiculous, such as the ritual of the scapegoat, which we will discuss. Finally, by the late 19th century, when Reform first took hold in Germany, the prevailing Christian religion was Protestantism, which was born rejecting the need for priests to intercede with God. The Reform movement stressed that Jews were a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, felt uncomfortable with a prayer service that emphasized the temple and the hereditary priestly class in which that high priest was required to intercede for the Jewish people. So what then is the Avodah service doing in our current Yom Kippur service? One answer is found on page 446 of Mishkan HaNefesh. Even if we no longer believe animal sacrifice is the best way, or any way, of drawing near to God, those services are a precious family heirloom, a reminder of where we came from and how our ancestors lived and how they worship God. It can teach us and remind us, draw us near to those who came before us, and, as it did for them, pave our way to a life of purpose. But what if we find the sacrificial cult repugnant, with its ritualistic slaughter of animals left and right? We live in a culture which is increasingly distant from the slaughter of animals. Some of us don't eat meat at all, and those that do don't slaughter their own animals. Many of us have never seen cows or goats or sheep except at a petting zoo, and most of us have never seen an animal butchered. In the grocery store, the meat comes headless, skinless, often boneless, on a styrofoam tray wrapped in plastic. We don't have animals in our backyard. We don't live with them, feed them, take care of them. We might have pets, but we certainly can't imagine eating them. How then can the ritualized sacrifice of animals be meaningful to us? I say it can allow us to walk in our ancestors' sandals. It is hard to emphasize enough how different their life was from ours. One example which stands out for me, when asked who is wealthy, Rabbi Yossi, a Talmudic sage, said, "Anyone who has a bathroom close to his table." This seems rather pedestrian for such an exalted rabbi, but you see, they did not have indoor plumbing. As for their animals, they just didn't own animals, they lived with their animals. Their lives depended on their animals. If their animals got sick and died, they might die. When they ate meat, which was probably rare, a special treat, they usually slaughtered their animals themselves. And when they sacrificed the best of their animals to God, they were sharing their best food with God. For most of the animals, after the sacrifice had been made, were eaten by the people and the priests. The Hebrew word for sacrifice is korban, which comes from the root karev, to draw near. Sharing their food with God as they would share it with their family was, for them, a natural way to draw near to God. Today we have no problem respecting the customs of other cultures which are very different from our own. The Maasai in Africa drink the blood of their cattle. The Inuit hunt, kill, and butcher seals. We don't reject these cultures just because their customs are different from ours. Just as we can cultivate kavod, honor, with respect to other cultures in our own time, we should do no less with respect to Jews who lived several thousand years ago, and also bring kavod to bear on our relationship with them, and try to appreciate how their form of worship brought them near to God. I submit we are not that different from our ancestors. If we returned to the life of our ancestors, if we kept cattle, if we slaughtered our own meat, the sacrificial rites would seem a natural extension of our daily lives. We would not be put off by the gore, and we would appreciate how the rituals truly allowed us to draw near to our God. What was the traditional Avodah service like? Well, the centerpiece was a story, the story of the performance of the rituals of Yom Kippur in the temple. And the centerpiece of that story is the story of the high priest on the big day. There is nothing like it today. The closest we come to it is perhaps the countdown to the launch of a rocket to outer space. Imagine the days, weeks, months, and years of training for the astronaut, both physical and mental. Finally, from among her fellows, she is chosen. Now, there is more preparation for the mission. As the day approaches, she is isolated from others, so she will not catch an illness that would prevent her from accomplishing her mission. She's given a thorough medical examination to detect any hidden ailment which might interfere with her mission. She is then carefully outfitted in a special suit by a team of highly trained professionals. One mistake, one tear in the fabric, might cause them to scrub the mission. There, she's dressed. Her team walks her to the base of the rocket, to the elevator, to the nose cone, places her inside on her couch, carefully designed for her and only for her, and seals the door. She now waits, isolated from the world, for the exact calculated moment for liftoff. 1,000 steps on a checklist, 10,000, any one of them improperly done, could cause the mission to be aborted. Sitting in the nose cone, she knows how much her country counts on her, how terribly much the mission costs, in dollars and in years of efforts of thousands of her colleagues. She knows the dangers that have left some missions barely able to return to Earth, that others have ended in the death of her fellows. She knows that there are 100,000 parts to the rocket, and if, as has happened, one 20-cent O-ring fails, her mission could end in a fiery explosion. Now, it is her turn. That only begins to suggest the pressures that were on the high priest and the Israelite nation on Yom Kippur in the temple 2,000 years ago. He knew that any deviation from the prescribed ritual could end in disaster for him and for his community. He remembered what happened to Nadav and Abihu when they attempted to offer their first sacrifice to God. As is explained in Leviticus chapter 10, they each took his fire pan, as they had seen their father do, laid incense on it, as they had just seen their father do, and offered their sacrifice to the Lord. In response, fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them, and thus they died at the instance of the Lord. And the Lord never explained what they had done wrong. The Yom Kippur sacrifices were performed almost exclusively by the high priest. In his day and for his community, the high priest had power and responsibilities greater than General Eisenhower on D-Day, than the manager of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, or President Truman deciding whether to drop an atom bomb. The high priest knew that this offering and prayers were accepted, neither sword, plague, nor hunger would prevail in the coming year, and that if, God forbid, they were not accepted, the high priest would be stricken dead, and Israel would be orphaned and exposed to every ill. You might think that by the time a priest became high priest, he would know the ritual backwards and forwards. Not so much. During the first temple period of 410 years, there were 18 high priests, an average tenure of about 23 years. But in the second temple period of 420 years, when the high priesthood may have been chosen by political patronage, there were over 300 high priests, of which only 4 served more than a year. Thus, it was highly likely that the high priest would be a complete novice. This Yom Kippur would be his first, and probably his last, Yom Kippur as high priest. A week before Yom Kippur, he was secluded in the temple. Each day, he sprinkled the blood of the daily sacrifices, burnt the incense, cleaned away the ashes to acquaint himself with the Yom Kippur service. Each day, a team of elders from the Sanhedrin would coach him on the order of the service. Before sunset on the Day of Atonement, he fasted for fear that he might become impure during the sleep brought on by excessive food. He was then drilled in that part of the service only done on the Day of Atonement. They made him take an oath that he would not deviate in any way from the exact sequence of steps he was taught, because one omission, one variation could ruin the ceremony and prevent his people from atonement. They then stayed with him, keeping him awake all night, lest he have a nocturnal emission which would render him unfit for his duties. At dawn, they took off his ordinary priestly vestments, he immersed in a mikveh, and they dressed him with 8 golden garments and washed his feet. As he began the prescribed duties of the day, famished and sleep-deprived, He knew that his every action must be performed precisely in the order prescribed, an intricate dance. If he performed one later step before an earlier step, it is if it had not been done at all, and he would have to start over. And who knows whether there would be enough time to finish before the sunset. So he started. He burnt incense upon the inner altar, cleaned the wicks of the menorah, burnt the daily offering, and poured a cup of wine on the altar. So far, he had done only the regular job of a priest on a regular day. Then he took off the 8 golden garments, immersed himself again in the mikveh, and put on white linen garments. He approached the sacrificial ox for Yom Kippur and made confession according to the ritual formula for himself and his household, out loud, speaking the otherwise unspeakable name of God. I beg of you, God, he said, I have sinned, acted wickedly, and rebelled against you, I and my household. I beg of you, with your name, atone the sins that I have committed against you, I and my household. The priests and the common people standing in the courtyard heard him say out loud the otherwise unsayable name of God. 1 of 10 times he would say it aloud on that day, the only day of the year when they heard the name. And they prostrated themselves and said, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, blessed is his name, his glorious kingdom forever and ever. This, and not the sacrifices, was the central part of the temple service to them. The one time in the year when the people would hear the name of God, when they prayed Baruch Shem, blessed is his name, they were responding literally to the saying of the name. What does it mean that the people prostrated themselves? It means they bowed down with their knees to the floor and their foreheads on the ground. That in itself was something of a miracle, for the courtyard was packed with people when they were standing. There wasn't room for a single person more, but when they prostrated themselves, there was still room for everybody. The high priest walked across the courtyard where 2 identical goats were tethered. He chose one to be for God and one to be for Azazel, that was the scapegoat. He tied a red thread to the horn of the scapegoat and another red thread to a rock next to the sanctuary. He walked back to the ox on the other side of the courtyard and slaughtered it. He prepared the incense and again confessed his sins, this time for himself, his household, and the entire priestly clan. I beg of you, God, he said, I have sinned, acted wickedly, and rebelled against you, I and my household and the sons of Aaron, your holy people. I beg of you, with your name, atone the sins, iniquities, and rebellions that I have committed against you, I and my household and the sons of Aaron, your holy people. And when the people heard the name of God, they again bowed, prostrated themselves, offered thanks, and fell upon their faces and said, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. His next task was in the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go, and then only on Yom Kippur. The high priest had probably never been there, as he had to perform his duties alone without any help. Inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. Even to touch it might kill him. He remembered what happened to Uzzah, who, while the Ark of the Covenant was being moved to Jerusalem, accidentally touched it and kept it from falling over. We are told in 2 Samuel, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. He took a shovelful of coals in his right hand and a ladle with incense in his left, walked into the Holy of Holies, placed the incense and coals there, and left. Took the vessel of the ox's blood, re-entered the Holy of Holies, and sprinkled blood with his finger, in the exact prescribed manner, dipping his finger into the blood bowl, 1 time moving his hand up, 7 times moving his hand down, each time counting 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and 7. He left the Holy of Holies, put the vessel of the ox's blood on a stand, slaughtered the goat for God, and sprinkled the goat's blood in the same way as the ox's blood. Then he mixed the goat blood and the ox blood and sprinkled that mixture on a different altar. He approached the other goat, the one for Azazel, still alive, and made another confession, this time for the people. I beg of you, God, he said, They have sinned, acted wickedly, rebelled against you, your people, the house of Israel. I beg of you, with your name, atone the sins, iniquities, and rebellions that were committed against you by your people, the house of Israel. And the people, standing in the courtyard, hearing the holy name again, bowed, prostrated themselves, offered thanks, and fell upon their faces and responded, Baruch Shem Kavod Machuto Leolam Vaed. He handed the scapegoat off to another priest who would take it far out to the desert and push it over a cliff to kill it. He then cut open the slaughtered ox and goat, removed the sacrificial parts, and intertwined their limbs onto poles on which they would be burnt. He read aloud from the Torah pertaining to the day's service, then washed his hands and feet, took off his white garments, immersed himself for a third time that day, put on the golden garments, and again washed his hands and feet, and proceeded to sacrifice 2 rams. He burnt the fats of the sin offering and sacrificed the Musaf offering of the day. He again washed his hands and feet, put on the white garments, and re-entered the Holy of Holies. He removed the vessels used for the incense offering and again washed his hands and feet, took off his white garments, immersed himself in the mikveh a 4th time, put on the gold garments, washed his hands and feet, then offered up the daily afternoon sacrifice, burnt the daily afternoon incense, lit the candles of the menorah, washed his hands and feet. All in all, the Kohen Gadol wore 5 sets of garments, 3 golden and 2 white linen, immersed in the mikveh 5 times, washed his hands and feet 10 times. He sacrificed 2 lambs, 1 bull, 2 goats, and 2 rams, with accompanying mincha, wine, and incense offerings, the regular daily offerings, an additional one for Yom Kippur. He entered the Holy of Holies 4 times. The name of God was pronounced 10 times during the 3 confessions. If the ceremony had been performed properly, the red thread tied to the rock in front of the sanctuary would turn white, a symbol that the sins of the nation had been atoned for, and the people would rejoice. The high priest then made a celebration for all his loved ones after entering the Holy of Holies in peace and leaving in peace unharmed, his atonement accepted, and said this prayer. May it be your will, Adonai, our God and God of our fathers, that this year approaching us and all your people, the house of Israel, be a year in which your good treasure will be opened for us. A year of plenty, a year of blessing, a year of good decrees declared by you, a year of grain, wine, and oil, a year of profit and success, a year of your divine presence in your temple, a year of economic stability, a year of good life in your presence, a year of dew and rain and warmth, a year of deliciously sweet fruits, a year of atonement for all our iniquity, a year in which our food and drink will be blessed, a year of prosperity in business, a year of attending our holy temple, a year of abundance, a year of delight, a year in which our offspring and the fruit of our land will be blessed, a year in which our going and coming will be blessed, a year in which our community will be delivered, a year in which your mercy will be all around upon us, a year of peace and tranquility, a year in which you lead us upright in our land, a year in which no woman shall suffer a miscarriage, a year in which you bring us all joyfully to our land, a year in which your people Israel will not be in need of any other's help or the help of any other people, for you will bless the work of their hands. And the people all said, and may we all say, may it be God's will, Kain Yehi Ratzon.